Okay, we're all set.
Question. Mr. Moholy-Nagy, what is your attitude toward art today? Answer. I do not believe so much in art as in mankind. Every man reveals himself. Much of it is art.
When we think of artists in the 20th century, we might think of Picasso or Magritte or Kandinsky, but why don't we think of Lazlo Moholy-Nagy?
One of the most remarkable men, artists, and craftsmen of the century. Certainly one of the great teachers of our time.
Moholy was one of the leading figures of the early 20th century avant-garde. He was very radical and groundbreaking, and he really put into question what is art.
Moholy was one of the most versatile artists in the 20th century.
Movie and everything, photography, typography, theater, very much interested in theater product design.
He also was an incredibly important teacher in the German Bauhaus, and then later started the new Bauhaus in Chicago. And we could see that as a continuation of the German Bauhaus, but I think it's so much more.
Moholy's almost 10 years in Chicago were absolutely foundational for the history of 20th century art. It was during his time in Chicago that he was able to realize his vision of a school that could unite art and design and a kind of education that would work toward the social betterment of all citizens through art.
The Bauhaus was established in 1919 in the provincial town of Weimar in central Germany by Walter Gropius, a hotshot young architect. And in 1923, he invited László Moholy-Nagy to teach the introductory course.
The Bauhaus was a radical experiment that really upended teaching and upended design. And their goal was that design could affect every aspect of life and society.
You should be bold. You should have the courage to be utopian and think out certain things which may be desirable for men to have.
They had this remarkable idea of training artists and designers together, starting with the preliminary course in which they would actually unlearn perhaps what they had learned before. They would start from the beginning with different kinds of materials and color theory and other kinds of exercises.
My idea was always we have to do something together. We have to destroy these separations between painting and sculpture and architecture and design and so on. It is all one.
Gropius had brilliant judgment in the people he hired. He hired Paul Klee. he hired the Russian emigre Wassily Kandinsky. He hired Oskar Schlemmer, and at the end of March of 1923, he hired Lazlo MoholyNagy. Now you have to understand that Lazlo MoholyNagy had identified as a visual artist for a grand total of 5 years at that point. He had never gone to art school. He spoke German with a heavy Hungarian accent. He had never taught. And we know from the private correspondence of the faculty that they were furious. Why did he hire this person?
Moholy was one of these people who you either really loved or you really hated. I think a lot of the painters were kind of appalled by him, pushing his machine aesthetic.
MoholyNagy was an extremely lively personality. He was almost childlike in his interest that everything new which came up in techniques and so on electrified him. He went right after that.
Gropius was very impressed with the fact that Moholy-Nagy did not focus his writings or his practice solely on art. In fact, he recognized that the kernel of Moholy-Nagy's project was really pedagogical. It was to train people to live happier, more productive lives in modernity, in a technologically infused environment.
So in 1924, Moholy had a show at the Sturm Gallery in Berlin, one of the first shows that he had as a professor at the Bauhaus. And he showed these things that we call telephone pictures. These porcelain enamel on steel paintings that were manufactured by a sign factory.
I had the factory's color chart before me, and I sketched my paintings on graph paper. At the other end of the telephone, the factory supervisor had the same kind of paper divided into squares. He took down the dictated shapes in the correct position. It was like playing chess by correspondence.
Now, this story is probably not true, but it doesn't matter. The point is that you could produce paintings at different scales without ever touching a canvas or the paints themselves.
The gesture was sensational. It caused quite a bit of controversy. If we can make paintings by telephone, why don't we throw out Goethe and just do things by typewriter and forget the quilled script?
We must demand that painterly methods of representation shall disappear and their place be taken by mechanical means of representation.
His fellow painters, I think, were confused by the fact that Moholy-Nagy was practicing, embodying a new conception of what it meant to be an artist, and a new conception of what art could be. So he was resented by the faculty. They saw his art as mechanistic. They saw him as a techno-mad, anti-humanist figure, but he was very popular with the students. He was charismatic, he was good-looking, he was charming. We know that a number of young women were in love with him, and his art career continued to thrive. So he was a real dynamo during those early years at the Bauhaus.
He was an experimental fellow. He tried everything out himself. He was perhaps the closest friend of mine in the Bauhaus.
Moholy-Nagy quit the Bauhaus after Gropius resigned in 1928. He set up his freelance studio in Berlin, and he was very successful. Very successful. In fact, he became, I would say, a minor celebrity in Germany, and he met his second wife, Sibyl, in the early 30s. Then she wanted a family, and that's how Hattila was born, named after a little town in Finland, which he visited with his girlfriend rather than with Sibyl.
My dad was waffling between my mother on the one hand and Ellen Frank on the other. So my mom, I guess, pried him loose. He didn't really want kids. He couldn't see fitting them into his life, but she did. So he told her that if she was going to keep the baby, she'd have to raise it. I was born in Berlin, October 11th, 1933.
People forget they did not run for their lives in 1933. The National Socialist Party was gaining ground. One of the first laws that was passed was restrictions on foreigners working in Germany. He was a Hungarian citizen, and it became increasingly difficult for him to work there. And it became clear from the official cultural policy that modernism, at least left-wing modernism, was anathema.
Abstract art was always seen as not just provocative, but revolutionary. You make abstract art not because it looks pretty. You make abstract art because you want to change the world. I mean, it might sound crazy that circles and squares are supposed to be the foundation of a revolutionary society, but what's at the heart of it is that the way that we interface with the world is shaped by how we see it.
A program was introduced by the Nazis to remove what they saw as degenerate art from public collections. And these were curated into a big exhibition that first opened in Munich called the Entartete Kunstausstellung, the Degenerate Art Exhibition. It was joked that it was the greatest modernist exhibition ever put on by anybody, ever seen. Moholy-Nagy's work was included as well.
His art and his thinking, this idea of modernism, of abstraction, was absolutely unwelcome in Nazi Germany, and therefore he couldn't make a living there.
And Moholy-Nagy had to go abroad to work.
My dad had connections in Holland. He always went where he had connections, so he went to Amsterdam, and he stayed there for a year. My mom and I were in Berlin. And then he decided to move to England, where my sister was born March 25th, 1936 in London. When he got to London in 1935, he and his colleague Jurj Kepes established a studio that did advertising and commercial work. He'd bought a house and he was getting established, but he did jump at the chance to come to the United States.
And so this opportunity comes up where there's a trade association in Chicago that wants to kind of create a school along Bauhaus lines.
The Association of Arts and Industries in Chicago said, we need a school like the Bauhaus in Germany.